Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nycos Nightly News. I am, of course, going to be doing the reports on all of the campaigns that are currently active, as indicated by my graphic. Heralds of the Change, Strangers in the Strange Land, and Prismborn are reporting this week. And so we will be bringing you all of the details of what's going on in each of those areas. Before we do that, make sure you go down below and hit all of the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and we'll get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
So, welcome to tonight's episode. We will be covering the 3 different campaigns. Now, to give you an idea of where we are, let's take a look at our graphic real quickly. We're going to be dealing with the groups Heralds of the Change, Strangers in the Strange Land, and Prismborn. These are 3 of the campaigns that are currently active. If you want to know more about the specific campaigns, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Nycos. And there you can get all of the updates on the campaign so far. They're not all uploaded yet, but I am working on getting them done. So let's start, first of all, with the group Heralds of the Change. As you may recall, the group had endeavored to move towards the city of Bastion. The Luthanen had determined that the course of the army should be to support the loyalists there against the invading empire. And on the way there, they were accosted by a rather nasty dragon who had basically destroyed their aerial support and also crippled their army considerably by injuring several of their archery units. And the army had sequestered itself in the Vale of the known as the Cradle of the Red Mother, and so we will be following up on that story. The Strangers in the Strange Land group. I always have to kind of recall where we are. The Strangers in the Strange Land group were themselves, now I'm trying to remember where they are, were endeavoring to make it towards one of the cities so they could make reports on what was going on to get urgent word to the Luthanen, and we'll get more information on that as we go along. And then, of course, the Prismborn are dealing with entirely different subjects and are in the city of Nexus. So we will be endeavoring to cover all 3 of these as we go forward. Getting behind myself as this thing goes. Now I needed to be there. It's okay. Yay, I'm being real pro this one.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
I'd forgotten which screen I'd link that to, so I apologize for that double run of the header. In any case, we are talking about the Heralds of the Change for the next 3 points, the first 3 points of the Nycos news you need to know. And the first is that the army is still ensconced in the Red Mother's cradle. They are still suffering from residual losses from their engagement with the scintillating dragon that they just engaged with, and the injuries are they had a rather rough go of it and lost a considerable other number of additional members of their army, and It was with a heavy heart that the Luthanin determined that he needed to restructure his army and sent word to the Empress that he was putting this Western army, this Eastern army under direct command of one of his underlings, for lack of a better term, and had elevated that person to Eastern Army Command, and that information has been dispatched to the Empress. Additionally, it was determined that the obligations of the Luthanin and his retinue was redirected toward gathering information on what the Empire is doing, and endeavored to depart from the army at the cradle and continue their movement, thereby also occluding what their plans were from the enemy in the process. Therefore, when the Luthanin made his... got two different screens on here, just a second. When the Luthanin made his departure and put the others in command, he established a way of communicating with them so that he can keep in touch with what's going on, and therefore provide information that, of course, is secure information, and therefore it is only something that is known to the Luthanin, and therefore to all of you by way of our reporting. But that means that the activities of the Luthanin will now be on individual reports, and any communication from him to those of you who are enjoined will be through the Raven network, and instead of here in the reports. So I will not be providing any additional guidance or leadership from the Luthanin in this position, but instead I will be providing for you information on what the adventuring group is actually indeed doing. With that transition, therefore, we are now looking at the adventure from the standpoint of the group, and they have, upon leaving the Luthanin, they went down the valley, staying in the shadows of the Red Mother and moving out into the eastern realms. And en route, they have discovered what appears to be yet another ziggurat. Although this appears to be an abandoned one, and may or may not be part of the network of the ziggurats as known currently, and it appears to be abandoned, or shall I say forgotten. And so in entering the ancient location, they basically had to break in. They had to figure out a way to get past a solid stone block that had been placed specifically in the entryway to prevent people from accessing it. And they therefore have breached the ancient temple and have entered its interior. They have found remains of a human population, roughly 100 individuals, who have been, it appears to be either starved to death or were executed and were stacked like cordwood in the main hallway under the structure, and so they are endeavoring to find who or what placed them there. It's going to be interesting, and there'll be more information on that next week's report. Alrighty, so now we are going to be talking about the strangers in a strange land, and we're going to be referring to the mystery of the Singleton. As the adventurers had left off last week, they had decimated one of the burial sites of the group that was formerly known as the Ixal, and in the destruction of them, they were affected by a single one of them who had escaped. And while they needed to destroy the nest, they also determined they needed to hunt down that singleton. And as they moved towards doing so, they discovered it within a farmyard, and it was standing motionless, although it had apparently just recently killed a local farmer. So they were investigating that when they found that there was indeed a living survivor who apparently, although a youngster, was more than prepared for living on their own and maintaining their position, and pledging to provide information as necessary whenever the adventurers might come by about what was going on in the local area. The interesting elements of this singleton was that he was, as I said, completely motionless, standing in the yard of this farmer, and there didn't appear to be anything wrong with it except that it had ceased moving, and so they determined that more than likely it had gotten too far from its source. On later consideration, they determined that it probably had ceased moving once it moved to its maximum distance from its data source, which would have been the brain bug of the hive, which they had destroyed, and that its demise more than likely coincided with the destruction of the brain bug. So that's the first thing you need to know about them. The second thing you need to know about them is that as they continued their movement northward, they engaged once again an army of the Luthanin. Army of the Imperium, and the Imperator's forces were encamped almost strategically south of Ulmara, probably as a defensive rear guard as the army withdrew. But as it happened, it was also the same unit that they engaged not 6 weeks ago when they crossed paths of the rear guard as they were endeavoring to make it towards the city of Ulmara. As they went through this, they discovered that there was an individual being held in stocks that apparently was very emaciated, badly treated, and in generally bad repair. And they determined that they would recover this individual. Now, as they did so, they also gathered some considerable scuttlebutt about the activities of the Imperator's army, and it appears, according to their reports, that Tirkun, a nation that hasn't been heard from for literally iterations, has entered the fray on the side, if you will, of the Imperium. And so that changes somewhat the balance of power. And so they were endeavoring, therefore they were going to need to get to a news location in order to be able to provide that information. So they determined they still needed to go north to get to a train station and therefore a reporting site to be able to reach out to the Luthanin. But they also determined that they were going to rescue this poor soul that was being so poorly treated. As they did so, there was a major discovery about that individual, partially because of what he said, but also because of information that they had gathered previously, because they did recognize him as the individual that they had run into before. It was in this case that they discovered that the individual who was imprisoned was indeed the manifestation of Zothar. This was surprising because he wasn't in any form other than that of a mortal, and they determined that he actually fundamentally is, in his current form, immortal. He could not be killed or destroyed, and that he was indeed still the very species that had been. He was actually the physical manifestation of Baphomet. He was the physical form of Baphomet, who is currently imprisoned in another location. But they were not aware of that. Instead, they found this individual who had been seeking to regain his power after all these years and was endeavoring to get himself free. But they engaged with him, and fortunately one of them happened to have Nycos, one of the items of power, and dispatched him. Incidentally, they were merely thinking that weapon would destroy this being, but instead it actually provided the final demise of Tongue Eater himself. So. In reference to our final group, the last three news nuggets you need to know is that the city of Nycos is under siege. The adventuring group, the Prism-born, approached the city via their vessel and found that the city was being attacked from the south by a combined force of Urgluk, these bestial creatures known to be part of I guess you'd call it a kingdom, but the domain of Ustish has apparently determined that they will support the Empire for some reason and moved against Nycos and are currently laying siege to the location using siege engines and other weapons of war in order to interfere with and perhaps break the resolve of the people of Nycos. The adventurers determined that they were going to I'm getting ahead of myself. The adventurers determined they would enter the city discreetly, and in that process, they went to the library so that they could access it to send information to the combined adventuring groups of the enjoined, and then spent I guess you'd call it an enjoyable afternoon, delving into the archives and gathering additional information, as they have already successfully closed out one of the ziggurats, and the adventurers also discovered that the Tongue Eater issue has been resolved. They themselves, having the actual spirit of Baphomet and captured in their mirror trap, are determining how to properly dispatch a creature from the outer realms when there is no access to the outer realms. So they did some research into the ziggurats and discovered that they themselves, the very devices that are known as prisons, also end up being power sources and engines for actually physically moving the world of Nycos itself. And so they are endeavoring to gather information about that will allow them the opportunity to do so as necessary. And it may be, by their estimation, if they wish to banish this being, they will have to endeavor to put the world in danger by accessing the outer realms, which means moving the planet again. So we will see how that works out. In that process, however, they realized that they had gotten within the city, but endeavored to figure out a way to get out, as it was under siege, and therefore you can't just walk out the gates. And so they determined that they would have to pass through the catacombs under the city and figure out a way to get out. And they had contacted the Vanguard. So this was their first contact with the Vanguard. So they will be able to hereafter potentially use the same resources as others to move about within the realm of Nycos. But they needed to find a location under the city which would allow them to escape. And it was for this reason that they went into the underground of the city, and having worked their way into the depths, discovered that there was an entire city under the city, which seemed to be something of a large dome that covered several major streets within the old city, and discovered that there had been a devastating weapon at some point used on the city of Nexus itself that was so powerful that it even had killed the messengers of death known as the drivers of Bowl. So a lot of interesting information there to be discovered, and of course they are now endeavoring to get back to their vessel and therefore to provide that information. They considered going back up into the city itself to use the messaging system, but endeavored instead to go to their vessel as they feared that under siege the location might be compromised. So they are therefore now returned to their vessel and are proceeding to the next part of their story, and more data will come from them as soon as they get to another reporting point. So I want to thank you for being here. This has been Nycos' Nightly News and the 9 news nuggets you need to know. If you have any other questions or information, make sure you follow what's going on the Patreon, and also realize the product is now available at Shopify. I'll put the link down below for that. And also you can get the PDFs at nycosrpg.com. See you all next time.